Hey guys, tonight we're venturing deep into the heart of 17th century Africa to a land of lush river valleys, sprawling savannas, and kingdoms rich in culture and tradition, but also facing the rising, often brutal, tide of European colonial ambition. Yeah, we're going to trace the entire extraordinary life of a woman who defied expectations, battled empires, and became a legendary symbol of resistance, Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, in what is now modern-day Angola. Imagine yourself in her world. The air is warm and humid, carrying the scent of wood smoke from countless cooking fires, the rich aroma of tropical earth after a sudden rain, and perhaps the distant, rhythmic beat of drums echoing through the tall grasses. This is a world of powerful kings, intricate courtly life, and ancient spiritual beliefs, but also a world teetering on the edge of profound, often violent, change. You probably wouldn't survive your first week in Nzinga's royal court without a razor-sharp intellect, a keen understanding of rapidly shifting power dynamics, an ability to distinguish a genuine ally from a Portuguese spy with a suspiciously friendly smile, and absolutely no expectation of finding a decent Wi-Fi signal for your troubles. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, it's a true delight to see where you're all joining me from as we embark on these historical voyages. Please drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in West Central Africa, in the latter part of the 16th century. Our story begins around the year 1583, the approximate birth year of Nzinga Mbande. The specific kingdom we're focusing on is Ndongo, a powerful Mbundu-speaking state located in the highlands inland from the Atlantic coast, roughly corresponding to parts of modern-day northern Angola. Ndongo was one of several Mbundu kingdoms in the region, a land characterized by rolling savannas, dense forest along its river valleys, and a network of rivers, most notably the Kwanza River, which served as vital arteries for trade, communication, and life itself. The climate was tropical, with distinct rainy and dry seasons, supporting agriculture based on crops like millet, sorghum, beans, and later, New World imports like maize and cassava. The political structure of Ndongo revolved around a ruler known by the title Ngola. This title, Ngola, is actually the origin of the name Angola. The Ngola was the supreme political, military, and often religious leader, presiding over a complex society with a hierarchy of nobles, provincial chiefs, warriors, farmers, artisans, and increasingly individuals whose lives were tragically enmeshed in the burgeoning slave trade. The royal court would have been a center of power and ceremony, a place of intricate etiquette, political maneuvering, and the display of royal authority. Imagine audiences with Angola, petitioners seeking justice, tribute being brought from vassal chiefdoms, and the constant subtle dance of influence and obligation that characterized courtly life. Royal succession was not always a straightforward father-to-son affair. It could involve complex matrilineal and patrilineal considerations, and often intense competition and even violence among potential heirs. Musical chairs, but with more spears and less music, might be one way to describe the succession process if you were feeling particularly cynical. Into this already complex world, a new and profoundly disruptive force had arrived: the Portuguese. They had first reached the mouth of the Congo River further north in the late 15th century, and by the mid-16th century had established a more permanent presence on the Angolan coast, founding the settlement of Luanda in 1576. Their initial motives were a familiar colonial cocktail: a search for precious metals, particularly the rumored silver mines, which proved largely illusory in this region, a desire to establish trade routes for valuable African goods like ivory and beeswax, and, increasingly, an insatiable demand for enslaved Africans to labor on the burgeoning sugar plantations of Brazil and other Portuguese colonies. The Kingdom of Ndongo was a significant Mbundu-speaking state in West Central Africa, modern Angola, that, by the late 16th century, found itself increasingly engaged in complex, often intensely hostile interactions with Portuguese colonial ambitions, which were largely centered around their coastal stronghold of Luanda and the rapidly expanding, devastatingly brutal transatlantic slave trade. The Portuguese impact was multifaceted. They introduced new goods textiles, wine, tools, but also new weapons firearms, which dramatically altered the nature of warfare in the region. They brought Christian missionaries, seeking to convert the local populations, often with a complex interplay of genuine religious fervor and cynical political expediency. Most destructively, their demand for slaves fueled internal conflict, like encouraging raids, warfare between African states, and the capture of individuals to be sold into a lifetime of bondage across the ocean. The Portuguese often allied themselves with certain African groups against others, or exploited internal rivalries within kingdoms like Ndongo to further their own aims. They were a powerful, technologically advanced, and often ruthless new player in an already intricate political landscape. Imagine trying to negotiate a trade deal for, say, a shipment of fine raffia cloth, while the other party is simultaneously trying to enslave your second cousin and helpfully offering to sell you muskets that might just be used against you next year. Diplomacy was tricky. Nzinga was born into this cauldron of change and conflict. Her father was Ngola Kiluwanji Kia Samba, a powerful ruler of Ndongo. Her mother was Kakalika Nzinga, sometimes referred to as Kangala in other sources, a point where oral traditions and colonial records sometimes offer variations. Nzinga was not her father's only child. She had siblings, including a brother, Ngola Mbande, who would later play a crucial, if often tragic, role in her life, and at least two sisters. Kifunji and Mukambu, also known by other names like Kambu and Funji, who would become important allies. Historians still debate the precise extent of Portuguese military and political influence deep in the Ndongo interior at the very moment of Nzinga's birth around 1583 versus their primarily coastal presence at Luanda and their more indirect commercial or slave-raiding impacts further inland at that specific early date. It's likely a picture of gradually encroaching power, like a slow but relentless tide. A particularly potent, quirky, or fringe tidbit, often repeated in Nzinga's story, is the legend that she was born in a difficult breech position and that her umbilical cord was found wrapped around her neck. According to Mbundu tradition, this was interpreted by royal diviners as a powerful omen. It signified that the child would be exceptionally proud, strong-willed, intelligent, and perhaps destined for greatness, but also that her life might be filled with immense difficulties, obstacles, and perhaps a tendency to be a disruptive or challenging figure. Whether this specific birth story is literal truth or a later embellishment designed to foreshadow her extraordinary life, it certainly captures the essence of the woman she would become. One can almost hear the royal diviner, after a long night of interpreting chicken entrails or the patterns of kola nuts, announcing, "Well, Angola, the good news is she's going to be a force of nature. The bad news is she's going to be a force of nature. Invest in good advisors and maybe some extra strong palace walls." The name given to her at birth was Nzinga, sometimes spelled Jinga or Ginga in European sources. The Mbande part of her name, Nzinga Mbande, is a royal title or lineage indicator. The world she entered was one where her royal status offered privilege but also immense danger. It was a world where tradition and change were locked in a fierce embrace, where the whispers of ancient spirits mingled with the sharp crack of Portuguese muskets. It was, in short, a turbulent dawn for a princess destined to become a queen, a warrior, a diplomat, and an enduring legend. The air itself in Ndongo must have felt charged with an uneasy energy, the calm before a very long and very consequential storm. And Nzinga, from her very first breath, was at its heart. Nzinga Mbande has been born into the royal family of Ndongo, a kingdom grappling with the beauty of its land, the complexities of its own internal politics, and the increasingly ominous shadow of Portuguese colonial ambition. Her birth, perhaps marked by prophecies of a formidable and challenging destiny, sets the stage for a truly extraordinary life. But before she could become the renowned queen, warrior, and diplomat, she was a child, a young princess growing up within the confines and customs of her father's court. What kind of education, what formative experiences would shape this future leader in late 16th and early 17th century West Central Africa? Let's gently draw back the veil on Nzinga's royal youth and observe the lessons in power, resilience, and statecraft that were likely imprinted upon her from her earliest years. It's important to understand that Nzinga's education wouldn't have resembled a formal Western schooling system with classrooms. Books writing was not indigenous to Mbundu culture at this time, though she would later learn to read and write Portuguese and standardized curricula. Instead, her learning would have been deeply experiential, absorbed through observation, participation in courtly life, the rich oral traditions of her people, and practical instruction in the skills and knowledge deemed essential for someone of her royal status. Royal children in many sophisticated African kingdoms of this era, including Ndongo, received an informal yet rigorous and highly practical training in leadership, diplomacy, history, and sometimes even warfare, primarily by observing the workings of the royal court, listening to the deliberations of elders and counselors, participating in age-appropriate ceremonies, and learning from the accumulated wisdom of praise singers, storytellers, and royal tutors. From a very young age, Nzinga would have been immersed in the intricate world of her father's court. She would have witnessed Angola Kiluanji, Kaya Samba receiving envoys from neighboring chiefdoms or perhaps from the Portuguese settlement at Luanda. She would have listened, perhaps from the periphery at first, to the debates among royal advisors, the settling of disputes, the planning of trade expeditions, or the mobilization of warriors. These were real-time lessons in statecraft: how to negotiate, how to command respect, how to identify an ally or a threat, how to weigh options and make difficult decisions. She would have learned the importance of eloquence, of persuasive speech, and the subtle art of political maneuvering. The court was a stage, and every interaction was a performance of power and status. A young Nzinga, described in many accounts as exceptionally intelligent and observant, would have been a keen student of these daily dramas. Note to self: she might have mentally recorded after a particularly tricky negotiation her father handled. Flattery works wonders on the envoy from Matamba, but the Portuguese governor seems more susceptible to veiled threats and a really good poker face. Her cultural education would have been rich and deep, transmitted through the vibrant oral traditions of the Mbundu people. She would have learned the history of her kingdom, the genealogies of the royal lineage, the epic tales of past Ngolas and heroic ancestors. She would have absorbed the proverbs, the wise sayings that encapsulated generations of experience and moral understanding, religious rituals, the worship of the ancestors and the local deities Mahamba, the role of diviners and spiritual leaders. All these would have been an integral part of her upbringing, shaping her worldview and her understanding of the sacred forces that governed life. She would have learned the songs, the dances, the intricate social etiquette expected of a princess. This wasn't just culture in an abstract sense. It was the very fabric of her identity and her people's identity. What about military training or exposure? While it was highly unusual for Mbundu women to be warriors in the same way, men were, though a strong tradition of powerful female leaders certainly existed. Nzinga lived in a time of constant conflict and military preparedness. Her father was a warrior king, frequently engaged in defending Ndongo's borders or dealing with internal rivals. It's highly plausible that Nzinga, even as a young girl, would have witnessed warriors' training, heard tales of battle, and understood the importance of military strength for the survival of the kingdom. She might have learned about strategy not through formal lessons, but through listening to her father and his commanders discuss campaigns, or through observing the marshalling of troops. Some traditions, perhaps colored by her later fame as a warrior queen, claim that Nzinga was her father's favorite child and that he recognized her exceptional abilities early on, allowing her unusual access to political discussions and even permitting her to accompany him on some military campaigns. At least as an observer, while the full extent of this is debated, it's clear that she developed a keen understanding of military matters long before she ever led an army herself. This wasn't Princess Pretty Pony training. This was Princess How to Not Get Your Kingdom Annihilated 101. A crucial part of her early education would have been observing the Portuguese. Their presence was an undeniable and growing factor in Ndongo's world. She would have seen their traders, their soldiers, their missionaries. She would have heard about their insatiable demand for enslaved people, their advanced weaponry firearms, which the Mbundu were increasingly trying to acquire themselves, their strange religious beliefs, and their often arrogant and duplicitous diplomatic tactics. These early encounters and observations would have been formative, shaping her understanding of this powerful, disruptive foreign presence. She would learn that the Portuguese could be potential trading partners, but also deadly enemies, that their promises were often unreliable, and their ultimate aims usually involved the expansion of their own power and wealth at the expense of African autonomy. This was a harsh but essential lesson in international relations, colonial style. Her relationship with her siblings, particularly her brother Ngolambande, who would later become king, would also have been part of her education in power dynamics. Royal families are rarely free of rivalries and tensions, and the Mbundu succession system, which didn't always follow strict primogeniture, could exacerbate these. Observing how her father managed these internal pressures, how he dealt with ambitious nobles or rival claimants, would have been invaluable. Some accounts suggest Nzinga was not always her father's, or later, her brother's most favored child, perhaps due to her strong will or perceived ambition. If true, this could have further honed her resilience, her political acumen, and her ability to navigate complex interpersonal and political currents. Being underestimated can sometimes be a powerful, if frustrating, learning tool. The degree to which Nzinga received any formal or informal specialized training in, say, specific Mbundu ritual practices, complex trade negotiations, or advanced military strategy during her youth, beyond general observation of court life and the tutelage expected for a royal child, is a subject of much speculation by historians, as contemporary written records from within Ndongo detailing her specific upbringing are non-existent. Our understanding is pieced together from later European accounts, oral traditions, and general knowledge of Mbundu royal customs. However, the sheer effectiveness she later displayed in all these areas strongly suggests a youth spent not in idle luxury, but in keen observation and diligent learning, absorbing every lesson her turbulent world had to offer. So, as young Nzinga moves through her formative years in the royal capital of Ndongo, picture her not just as a princess in waiting, but as an apprentice in the complex and often dangerous craft of power. Every conversation overheard, every ceremony witnessed, every diplomatic encounter observed, every story told by the elders, all were pieces of a puzzle she was slowly, astutely, putting together. The lessons she learned in her youth, in the shadow of her father's rule and the growing Portuguese threat, would become the very foundation upon which she would later build her extraordinary reign. Her classroom was the royal court, and her textbooks were the unfolding dramas of life, death, power, and survival in 16th century Africa. And she was, by all accounts, a very quick study. Princess Nzinga has absorbed the sights, sounds, and complex lessons of her royal youth in Ndongo. She has watched her father, Ngola Kiluanji navigate the treacherous currents of internal politics and the ever-increasing pressure from the Portuguese. But time, as it always does, marches on. Eventually, Ngola Kiasamba's reign comes to an end, and the mantle of leadership, the title of Ngola, passes to Nzinga's half-brother. Ngolambande, often just called Mbandi in many sources. This transition of power, likely occurring in the early 17th century, around 1617 marks a new chapter in Nzinga's life, one where she moves from being an observant princess to a figure more directly, if complicatedly, involved in the destiny of her kingdom. The reign of her brother would be a period of deepening crisis for Ndongo, and for Nzinga, a time of witnessing his struggles, perhaps offering her own counsel whether heeded or not, and undoubtedly drawing her own conclusions about what effective leadership in such perilous times truly required. Let's feel the atmosphere shift as the shadows of intrigue lengthen under Ngolambande's rule. The succession itself might not have been entirely smooth. As we've noted, Mbundu royal succession wasn't always a simple case of the eldest son inheriting a lineage, political alliances, personal strength, and sometimes even the perceived favor of the spirits or powerful factions within the nobility could all play a role. While Ngolambande did ascend to the throne, it's plausible there were other claimants or simmering resentments that he had to manage, or perhaps suppress. Nzinga, being a direct descendant of the previous Ngola and already recognized for her intelligence and strong will, might have been seen by some as a potential alternative, or at least a figure to watch closely. What kind of ruler was Ngola Mbande? The historical accounts, many of them written by Europeans who had their own biases and agendas, or derived from oral traditions recorded much later, often paint a rather unflattering picture of him. He is frequently described as being weaker, less politically astute, more indecisive, or perhaps more prone to cruelty or paranoia than his legendary father or his even more legendary sister. Nzinga. Historians debate the extent of Ngola Mbande's personal responsibility for the significant weakening of the Ndongo kingdom during his relatively short reign, c. 1617 to 1624, versus the argument that he faced an overwhelming and perhaps insurmountable combination of military and political pressure exerted by the Portuguese and their increasingly powerful Mbangala allies at that specific critical juncture in Angolan history. It's possible he was simply outmatched by the relentless colonial aggression and the brutal efficiency of the slave trade, which was tearing at the fabric of Mbundu society. Or perhaps his leadership truly was flawed, lacking the vision or the ruthlessness needed to navigate such treacherous times. It's not easy being Angola. Mbande might have complained to his royal advisors. The Portuguese want more slaves. The Mbangala want more war. My sister Nzinga keeps giving me that I could do this better look, and the royal diviner just told me the sacred chickens are looking distinctly unenthusiastic about my 5-year plan. What was Nzinga's position and role during her brother's reign? This is a crucial period for understanding her later actions. Was she a trusted advisor, her sharp intellect valued by her brother, or was she sidelined, viewed with suspicion as a potential rival? Her counsel ignored accounts vary. Some traditions suggest that Ngola Mbande, perhaps insecure in his own rule or jealous of Nzinga's capabilities, deliberately excluded her from power, or even treated her and her supporters harshly. He may have seen her popularity or her known strength of character as a threat to his own authority. If this was the case, Nzinga would have been an unwilling observer, watching as her kingdom suffered under her brother's leadership and the relentless Portuguese onslaught. She would have been learning, albeit painfully, from his mistakes, perhaps formulating her own ideas about how Ndongo should be governed and defended. Alternatively, some sources imply that, at least initially, Ngola Mbande might have recognized Nzinga's talents, particularly in diplomacy or statecraft, and perhaps utilized her in some capacity, even if unofficially. Her later role as an envoy to Luanda would suggest she wasn't entirely without influence or recognized skill. However, the dominant narrative suggests a relationship that was often fraught with tension and mistrust. The shadows of intrigue certainly deepened during this period. The Ndongo court would have been a hotbed of factionalism, with different nobles and royal relatives vying for influence, some perhaps advocating for accommodation with the Portuguese, others for more aggressive resistance. The Portuguese themselves were masters at exploiting such internal divisions, offering support to one faction against another to weaken the Ngola's overall power and advance their own slaving and territorial interests. They also increasingly relied on alliances with Mbangala warbands, highly mobile, militaristic groups of displaced warriors, often from diverse ethnic backgrounds, who lived by raiding and warfare, and who became formidable, if often terrifying. Allies for the Portuguese in their campaigns against Ndongo and other Mbundu states. The combination of Portuguese firearms and Mbangala ferocity was a devastating one. Ndongo suffered significant military defeats, territorial losses, and a catastrophic drain of its population through enslavement during Ngola Mbande's reign. The kingdom was, quite literally, bleeding. For Nzinga, this period must have been one of immense personal and political anguish. She would have witnessed the suffering of her people, the erosion of her kingdom's strength, and the apparent inability of her brother to stem the tide. It's during this time that a particularly tragic and often cited quirky or fringe tidbit, though it's treated as fact in many Nzinga biographies, is said to have occurred: the murder of Nzinga's young son. Some accounts claim that Ngola Mbande, consumed by paranoia and fear that Nzinga's son might one day challenge his own lineage for the throne, or perhaps as a brutal way to break Nzinga's spirit and eliminate her line, had the child killed. This act, if true, and it must be handled with the appropriate sensitivity for a sleep script, focusing on the emotional impact rather than graphic detail, would have been an unforgivable betrayal, a source of profound grief and righteous fury that would undoubtedly fuel Nzinga's later determination to seize power and avenge her losses. It adds a deeply personal layer to her already complex political motivations, whether through direct persecution, a desire to distance herself from her brother's disastrous policies, or simply a strategic retreat to gather her own supporters. Nzinga might have spent parts of her brother's reign in a state of semi-exile or opposition, perhaps in regions of Ndongo less directly under Mbande's control. She was observing, learning, and likely biding her time. The shadows of intrigue were not just around the throne, they were within the royal family itself, creating a toxic atmosphere of suspicion and fear. Nzinga was navigating these dark waters, her own destiny still uncertain, but her resolve perhaps hardening with every new disaster that befell her kingdom and her kin. The stage was being set for her to step out of those shadows, not just as a princess or a potential rival, but as a leader in her own right, forged in the fires of her brother's troubled reign. The kingdom of Ndongo is teetering on the brink. Under the reign of Nzinga's brother, Ngola Mbande, Portuguese military pressure, often amplified by their ruthless Mbangala allies, has become almost unbearable. The slave trade is decimating the population, territory is being lost, and the authority of the Ngola is crumbling. Desperation is setting in at the royal court. It is in this dire context, around the year 1622, that Ngola Mbande makes a fateful decision, or perhaps is persuaded by circumstances and advisors to make it. He will send a high-level diplomatic mission to Luanda, the Portuguese colonial capital on the coast, to try and negotiate a peace treaty. And the person he chooses to lead this incredibly delicate and dangerous embassy is none other than his intelligent, strong-willed, and perhaps somewhat intimidating sister, Nzinga Mbande. This mission will become one of the most legendary episodes in Nzinga's early life, a moment where her regal bearing, her sharp intellect, and her indomitable spirit are displayed for all, especially the Portuguese, to see. Let's accompany Nzinga on this pivotal journey to the heart of Portuguese power in Angola. Why Nzinga? Why would Ngola Mbande, who may have viewed his sister with suspicion or jealousy, entrust her with such a critical task? Perhaps he recognized, despite any personal animosity, her superior diplomatic skills, her eloquence, or her commanding presence. Maybe his other advisors had failed, or were unwilling to undertake such a risky mission. Or perhaps, more cynically, some at court saw it as a way to get Nzinga out of the way, sending her into the lion's den, not expecting her to succeed or even to return. Whatever the precise motivations, Nzinga accepts the charge. She understands the stakes. This isn't just about a treaty, it's about the very survival of Ndongo as an independent kingdom. Nzinga's diplomatic mission to Luanda in 1622 and her famous, almost theatrical confrontation with the Portuguese governor over the issue of a chair are well documented, though undoubtedly embellished and retold with dramatic flair in both European accounts and later oral traditions. And these events crucially highlight her innate astuteness, her regal dignity, and her refusal to be intimidated even before she formally became queen. Imagine Nzinga preparing for this embassy. She would not go as a humble supplicant. She would go as a representative of a sovereign, if currently beleaguered, kingdom. Her retinue would be carefully chosen. Advisors, attendants, guards, all selected to project an image of dignity and strength. Despite Ndongo's weakened state, she would have thought deeply about her strategy, her negotiating points, the concessions she might be willing to make, and the demands she would firmly uphold. The journey itself, from the Ndongo interior down to the coastal city of Luanda, would have been arduous and potentially dangerous. Passing through lands often ravaged by war and slave raids, she would be entering territory effectively controlled by the very power that was oppressing her people. Right, team. Nzinga might have briefed her delegation. We're heading into the heart of the Portuguese stronghold. Look regal. Speak eloquently. Don't accept any suspiciously watery ale. And whatever you do, nobody mentioned that time my brother accidentally declared war on a flock of particularly aggressive ostriches. We need to project competence. Her arrival in Luanda, a bustling colonial port city built by the Portuguese, would have been a stark immersion into a different world. She would see their stone fortifications, their European-style buildings, their sailing ships in the harbor, symbols of a foreign power that was so different from her own inland kingdom. She would observe their customs, their military presence, their religious practices. Missionaries were very active in Luanda, and the deeply unsettling sight of the slave trade in full operation, with captive Africans being held in barracoons, awaiting shipment across the Atlantic. This first-hand experience of the colonial center would have been profoundly informative, and likely deeply disturbing. The climax of her mission is her famous encounter with the Portuguese governor, João Correia de Sousa. Nzinga is ushered into his presence for negotiations. The governor, in a calculated display of dominance and disrespect, has arranged the room so that there is only one chair, his own, a symbol of his authority. Nzinga, as the representative of a supposedly supplicant African kingdom, is apparently expected to stand, or perhaps to sit on a mat on the floor, a traditional African custom, but one that, in this colonial context, would signify inferiority and subservience. The Portuguese officials watch, expecting her to be humbled. But Nzinga is not so easily cowed. This is where her quick wit and indomitable pride shine through, creating a moment that has become legendary. Without missing a beat, without showing any sign of offense or hesitation, Nzinga calmly turns and signals to one of her female attendants. The attendant immediately understands. She drops to her hands and knees, forming a human chair. Nzinga then gracefully sits upon her attendant's back, thus positioning herself at eye level with the seated Portuguese governor, meeting his gaze as an equal. The sheer audacity and regal composure of this act would have stunned the Portuguese. She had refused to be demeaned, had turned their intended slight into a demonstration of her own authority and the loyalty of her people. It was a masterstroke of political theater. One can only imagine the governor's face, his attempt at psychological dominance utterly deflated by a princess and her remarkably obliging human furniture. The minutes of that meeting probably just read, Item 1, seating arrangements. Unexpectedly complicated. Item 2, Princess Nzinga, not to be trifled with. The negotiations that followed were undoubtedly tough. Nzinga, having asserted her dignity, would have argued forcefully for Ndongo's cause a cessation of hostilities, the withdrawal of Portuguese forces and their Imbangala allies from Ndongo territory, the return of captured subjects, and the establishment of fair trade relations. She was intelligent, eloquent, and clearly fearless. The Portuguese, for their part, primarily wanted unimpeded access to trade routes, especially for slaves, and the submission of Ndongo to Portuguese overlordship, or at least a favorable treaty that served their interests. It is during or shortly after these negotiations in Luanda that another significant event occurs. Nzinga agrees to be baptized into the Christian faith, taking the name Dona Ana de Sousa Ana after the governor's wife, who reportedly befriended her, and de Sousa after the governor himself, a common practice for high-status converts to take the names of their sponsors. The sincerity versus the purely political motivations behind Nzinga's 1622 baptism as Ana de Sousa is a central point of ongoing discussion among historians of Africa and colonialism. Was it a genuine spiritual conversion? A pragmatic diplomatic strategy to gain favor with the Portuguese? Secure a better treaty? Or perhaps learn more about her adversaries from within their own religious framework? Or a complex mixture of all these things given her later actions? It's likely that political expediency played a major role, but it's also possible that she saw some genuine spiritual or intellectual appeal in aspects of Christianity, or at least in understanding the religion of her powerful European counterparts. The treaty that resulted from Nzinga's embassy, if one was formally concluded and honored, was likely a mixed bag. The Portuguese were not easily swayed from their colonial ambitions. However, Nzinga's mission was far from a failure. She had demonstrated Ndongo's refusal to be simply overrun. She had established herself as a formidable diplomatic presence, and she had gained invaluable first-hand experience of Portuguese power, tactics, and perhaps their vulnerabilities. She returned to Ndongo not just as a princess, but as a seasoned envoy, a leader who had looked the colonial power in the eye and refused to blink. The story of her human chair and her astute negotiations would become a cornerstone of her legend, a testament to her unyielding spirit long before she even wore the crown. A quirky or fringe tidbit, though one that underscores Nzinga's reputed ruthlessness or commitment to regal dignity, is that some traditions claim that after the attendant had served as her human chair during the audience with the Portuguese governor, Nzinga later ordered the woman to be killed. The supposed reason so that no one else could ever sit upon someone who had served as the seat for the queen or future queen of Ndongo, thus preserving the unique honor and power of that symbolic act. This story, whether true or apocryphal, adds a chilling edge to her legendary defiance, painting a picture of a leader who understood the potent, sometimes brutal language of power. For our sleepy purposes, we can focus on the impressive act of defiance itself and its immediate impact on the startled governor. Nzinga's embassy to Luanda was a defining moment. It announced her arrival on the political stage as a force to be reckoned with, a leader of intelligence, courage, and an unshakable sense of her own and her people's dignity. The lessons learned and the reputation forged in those tense encounters in the Portuguese capital would serve her well in the even greater struggles that lay ahead. As she moved from being her brother's envoy to becoming the queen who would fight for the soul of her kingdom, Nzinga has returned from her legendary diplomatic mission to Luanda. Her reputation enhanced, her understanding of the Portuguese deepened, but the fundamental problems facing the kingdom of Ndongo remain acute. The peace she may have negotiated with Governor João Correia de Sousa was likely fragile, always subject to the shifting priorities of Portuguese colonial policy and the relentless demand for enslaved people. Her brother, Ngola Mbande, still rules, but his grip on power and on the integrity of his kingdom is precarious. It is in this tense and unstable environment, around the year 1624, that the next major turning point in Nzinga's life occurs: the death of Ngola Mbande, and Nzinga's own audacious, complex, and ultimately successful bid to take the helm as ruler of Ndongo. This was no simple inheritance. It was a navigation through treacherous currents of courtly intrigue, patriarchal resistance, and outright war, a true trial by fire for the future queen. The circumstances surrounding Ngola Mbande's death are, like many details from this period, somewhat murky and open to interpretation based on often biased, contemporary sources. Some accounts suggest he died of illness, or perhaps even committed suicide in despair over his inability to protect his kingdom from Portuguese incursions and the devastating raids of their Imbangala allies. Other, more hostile sources, particularly those written by her enemies, sometimes hinted that Nzinga herself might have had a hand in her brother's demise, perhaps through poison or political maneuvering to clear her own path to power. However, most modern historians view these accusations with considerable skepticism, seeing them as part of a broader effort to delegitimize a powerful female ruler. The precise sequence of events and the nature of the power struggles that led to Nzinga's full assumption of queenship in Ndongo, including the fate of her nephew, her brother's son, if he indeed had a surviving heir at this point, are presented with conflicting details and biases in contemporary European missionary and administrative reports, as well as in later oral traditions, making a definitive, universally accepted reconstruction exceptionally challenging. What is generally agreed upon is that upon her brother's death, Nzinga moved swiftly and decisively to assert her claim to rule. This was not a straightforward matter. While Mbundu society, and Ndongo in particular, had traditions that allowed for female leadership, women could inherit property, hold significant ritual positions, and there were precedents for female regents or even rulers in some related groups. A woman claiming the title of Ngola, the supreme ruler, the king, was still a bold and potentially controversial move, especially in a time of intense military crisis that often favored male warrior leadership. Nzinga's initial claim might have been as regent for Ngola Mbande's young son, if such a son existed and was still alive. Remember the tragic stories about Nzinga's own son having been killed by Mbande? Acting as regent for an underage heir was a more conventional path for a royal woman to exercise power. However, it seems clear that Nzinga had ambitions beyond merely holding the throne for someone else. She aimed to rule in her own right. She faced considerable challenges to her authority. There would have been internal opposition from rival claimants to the throne, perhaps other royal relatives or powerful nobles who saw an opportunity in the vacuum left by Mande's death, or who simply objected to a woman taking ultimate power. Some factions might have favored a more conciliatory policy towards the Portuguese, while others might have demanded more aggressive resistance, and Nzinga would have had to navigate these differing opinions. The Portuguese themselves were a major obstacle. They generally preferred to deal with male rulers whom they perceived as more pliable or whom they could more easily install as puppet kings. A strong, independent-minded queen like Nzinga, who had already demonstrated her diplomatic formidable in Luanda, was likely not their ideal candidate for the throne of Ndongo. They might have actively supported rival claimants or sought to undermine her legitimacy from the outset. Nzinga became ruler or regent, then ruler of Ndongo around 1624 following her brother's death, and she faced immediate and significant challenges to her authority from both internal Mbundu political factions and the Portuguese colonial administration, who frequently sought to control or destabilize the kingdom for their own strategic and economic advantage. Particularly in relation to the slave trade, how did Nzinga consolidate her power in the face of such opposition? It was likely a combination of shrewd political maneuvering, forming alliances with key nobles and military leaders within Ndongo who recognized her capabilities, and, where necessary, a willingness to use force to eliminate or neutralize her rivals. The historical records are often brutal in their descriptions of 17th century African power struggles, as they are for contemporary European ones, for that matter, and Nzinga was operating in a world where political survival often demanded ruthless decisions. Again, PG-13 for our sleepy purposes means we focus on the strategic necessity and the complex choices rather than any graphic details. She was, in essence, running a very high-stakes campaign for a throne that was already under siege. Her platform, Vote Nzinga, she actually knows how to talk to the Portuguese without giving away the entire kingdom. Also, slightly less prone to despair-induced bad decisions than previous management. A fascinating and much-discussed aspect of Nzinga's early assertion of power is her adoption of traditionally male roles and titles. To overcome potential resistance to a female ruler, especially in a military context, Nzinga is said to have sometimes dressed in male attire, carried weapons, and even insisted on being referred to as Ngola or King Nzinga, rather than Queen. A quirky or fringe tidbit that appears in some European accounts, though its accuracy and interpretation are debated, is that she maintained a large retinue of men whom she dressed as women and referred to as her wives, while she herself took on the symbolic role of the male husband or king. This could be interpreted in many ways as a strategic subversion of gender norms to legitimize her rule in a patriarchal context, as a way to create a loyal, uniquely bound group of supporters, or perhaps as a reflection of complex Mbundu ideas about gender, power, and ritual that European observers struggled to understand. Whatever the exact meaning, it underscores her willingness to use unconventional methods to solidify her authority and command respect. Her early years as queen were dominated by almost constant warfare with the Portuguese and their Imbangala allies. The Portuguese, likely unhappy with a strong, independent Nzinga on the throne of Ndongo, and always eager to expand their slaving frontiers, frequently reneged on any previous peace agreements and launched fresh military campaigns into Ndongo territory. Nzinga, now in command, had to lead her people in a desperate defense of their homeland. This was where her early exposure to military matters. Her intelligence and her indomitable spirit truly came to the fore. She learned quickly, adapted her strategies, and proved to be a resilient and resourceful military leader, even in the face of superior Portuguese firepower. She understood that peace on Portuguese terms usually meant submission and the slow destruction of her kingdom through the slave trade, and she was determined to resist. Her formal coronation or acclamation as Queen of Ndongo, whenever and however it occurred, would have been a powerful moment, a declaration of her intent to rule and to defend her people. She was no longer just her brother's sister or his envoy. She was Ngola Nzinga, the sovereign of Ndongo, taking the helm in the midst of a storm. The pressures on her were immense, a relentless colonial enemy, internal dissenters, the constant threat of slave raids, and the heavy responsibility of leadership in a time of profound crisis. But Nzinga was not one to shy away from a challenge. The lessons of her youth, the tragedies she had witnessed, and her own formidable character had prepared her for this moment. The unofficial influence she might have wielded before was now official, and the kingdom of Ndongo, and indeed the history of Angola, would never be the same. Nzinga Mbande has now ascended to the leadership of Ndongo around the year 1624. Whether she initially ruled as regent for a young nephew or quickly asserted herself as queen in her own right, one thing was certain: she inherited a kingdom in crisis, a realm under relentless pressure from the Portuguese and their formidable Mbangala allies. The peace she may have negotiated in Luanda a couple of years earlier was, at best, a temporary lull, perhaps even a strategic Portuguese pause before their next aggressive push. Her early years as ruler were not to be ones of quiet administration or palace comforts. They were defined by almost constant warfare, a desperate struggle to defend her people and preserve some measure of Ndongo's sovereignty. We now follow Queen Nzinga into her first battles, as she begins to forge the lines of a resistance that would last for decades and become legendary. Imagine the immense challenges facing Nzinga as she took the helm. Queen Nzinga, during her early reign in Ndongo, engaged in near-constant warfare against the Portuguese colonial forces and their African allies, most notably the Mbangala warrior bands, employing a variety of military tactics to resist colonial encroachment, protect her people from enslavement, and maintain her kingdom's autonomy. The Portuguese, based in their coastal stronghold of Luanda and with fortified outposts pushing further inland, were driven by an insatiable appetite for enslaved Africans to work the plantations of Brazil and other colonies. They also sought to control trade routes, impose their authority over local rulers, and were ever hopeful of discovering mythical silver mines in the interior. Ndongo, a populous kingdom with established trade networks, lay directly in their path. Nzinga's initial military strategy would have been shaped by the realities on the ground. Ndongo's traditional armies, while brave, were often at a disadvantage against Portuguese forces equipped with firearms, muskets and cannons, which, though slow to load and unreliable in wet weather, had a devastating psychological and physical impact. The Portuguese also employed organized infantry formations and sometimes even small cavalry units, tactics unfamiliar to many Mbundu warriors. Adding to this was the ferocity and terrifying mobility of the Mbangala, a group of highly militarized, almost nomadic warrior bands who had emerged in the region and often allied themselves with the Portuguese for plunder and captives. The Mbangala were renowned for their brutal efficiency in warfare, their rejection of traditional agricultural life, and their complex, often harsh, initiation rites. Facing this combined Portuguese-Mbangala threat required immense courage, adaptability, and strategic thinking from Nzinga. It's like trying to play a complex game of chess where your opponent not only has more powerful pieces but also occasionally throws a live badger onto the board just to keep things interesting. So, what did these early battles and campaigns look like? The historical records, mostly from Portuguese sources which naturally have their own biases, describe a period of intense attritional warfare. Nzinga likely employed a mix of tactics. She would have led her Ndongo warriors in defensive battles, trying to protect key towns, agricultural areas, and the royal capital. But she also would have understood the need for guerrilla warfare, using her knowledge of the local terrain, the forests, the river systems, to launch surprise attacks, harass Portuguese supply lines, and then melt away before their superior firepower could be brought fully to bear. Hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and strategic retreats would have been essential for survival and for inflicting at least some damage on the invaders. Her military briefings probably involved a lot of, "Okay, team, Plan A is to look formidable and hope they get nervous. Plan B is to fight like honey badgers. And Plan Q is to remember where we parked the escape canoes, just in case." She faced immense challenges. Beyond the military superiority of the Portuguese in certain aspects, there was the constant problem of internal dissent, or wavering loyalty within Ndongo itself. Some Mbundu chiefs or nobles, Perhaps intimidated by Portuguese power or enticed by promises of trade or local autonomy under Portuguese suzerainty, might have been reluctant to fully support Nzinga's resistance, or might even have collaborated with the enemy. Nzinga had to be not just a military leader, but also a shrewd politician, constantly working to maintain alliances, reward loyalty, and punish treachery within her own kingdom. The human cost of these wars was devastating. Villages were burned, crops were destroyed, and vast numbers of Mbundu people were captured and sold into the transatlantic slave trade. This wasn't just a loss of population, it was a tearing apart of the social fabric, a constant drain of the kingdom's strength and future. Famine and disease often followed in the wake of warfare, further weakening Nzinga's ability to resist. Each battle, whether a minor skirmish or a major engagement, carried immense stakes. A quirky or fringe tidbit that appears in some accounts, though it's hard to verify with certainty from contemporary sources, is that Nzinga, even in these early campaigns, would sometimes personally lead her troops into battle or be very close to the front lines, inspiring them with her own courage and presence. While direct female participation in combat was not the norm for Mbundu royalty, Nzinga was clearly not a conventional ruler. If true, this practice would have enormously boosted the morale of her warriors and solidified their loyalty to her as a true warrior queen. Not just a figurehead, it would also have been a stark contrast to the often more remote command style of European generals of the era. Follow me, warriors of Ndongo. She might have cried. Our ancestors are watching, and the Portuguese have slightly better snacks back at their fort if we win. The precise balance of Nzinga's early military strategies, how much she relied on traditional Mbundu methods of warfare massed infantry with spears, bows, and shields, perhaps versus how quickly she adapted or innovated new tactics in direct response to the challenges posed by Portuguese firearms and the unique fighting style of the Imbangala, is a subject of ongoing analysis by military historians of Africa and scholars of this period. She was clearly a quick learner and a pragmatic leader, willing to adopt whatever methods proved effective, even if it meant breaking with tradition. Throughout the 1620s, Nzinga fought fiercely to defend Ndongo. She moved her capital several times to evade Portuguese advances, established fortified settlements, Colombos, and tried to rally various Mbundu groups to her cause. However, the relentless pressure from the Portuguese and their Imbangala allies, who were essentially professional warriors living off the spoils of war and slave raiding, proved incredibly difficult to withstand. Despite her bravery and strategic acumen, Nzinga found herself gradually losing ground, her kingdom shrinking, her resources dwindling. It must have been a period of immense frustration and sorrow, watching her ancestral lands being ravaged and her people suffering. It was likely during these years of intense, often losing defensive warfare that Nzinga began to realize that simply trying to hold on to the traditional heartland of Ndongo against the full might of Portuguese colonial ambition, especially with their access to firearms and their ruthless allies, might be an untenable long-term strategy. A new approach, a new power base, might be needed if her people and her own rule were to survive. This dawning realization, born from the crucible of these first brutal battles, would eventually lead her to a daring and transformative decision to look eastward, towards the less Portuguese-controlled kingdom of Matamba, and to forge a new destiny there. The lines of resistance were being drawn, but the map of that resistance was about to change. Queen Nzinga has been fighting a desperate, valiant, but increasingly difficult war to defend her ancestral kingdom of Ndongo against the relentless onslaught of the Portuguese and their Imbangala allies. For years, throughout the 1620s, she has employed every strategy at her disposal. Defensive battles, guerrilla tactics, diplomatic overtures, though those often proved fruitless with the Portuguese. Yet, the tide of colonial expansion and the devastating slave trade continues to erode her power base and decimate her people. The traditional heartland of Ndongo, centered around the royal capital and the fertile lands along the Kwanza River, is becoming increasingly untenable, a landscape scarred by warfare and depopulation. It is from this crucible of crisis, likely around 1629 or 1630, that Nzinga makes a bold, strategically crucial, and personally wrenching decision. She must retreat from her homeland and seek to establish a new, more defensible power base elsewhere. Her gaze turns eastward, towards the neighboring, less accessible, and perhaps more enigmatic kingdom of Matamba. Our sleepy journey now follows Nzinga on this path of exile, a path that will ultimately lead to the forging of a new, resilient kingdom under her command. The decision to effectively abandon the core territories of Ndongo could not have been an easy one for Nzinga. This was the land of her ancestors, the source of her legitimacy as Ngola. To retreat would mean ceding territory to her enemies, and perhaps appearing weakened in the eyes of some of her own followers and rival Mbundu chiefs. But Nzinga was a pragmatist, a survivor. She likely recognized that continuing to fight a purely defensive war in Ndongo, where the Portuguese had established forts and could more easily bring their military power to bear, was a losing proposition. A strategic withdrawal, a regrouping in a more defensible location, offered the best chance for long-term resistance and the preservation of her people's autonomy. It wasn't an admission of defeat, but a tactical redeployment, a classic live-to-fight-another-day strategy. "All right, everyone," she might have announced to her inner council. "The current real estate in Ndongo is proving a bit hostile. Excellent ambush spots, but the property values are plummeting due to excessive cannon fire. Time to explore investment opportunities further east. Pack light, but bring all the spears." So begins the journey eastward. This would not have been a solitary flight, but the movement of a significant number of people, Nzinga's most loyal warriors, her court officials, her family members including her sisters Kifunji and Mukambu, who remained crucial allies, and many ordinary Mundu people who chose to follow her rather than submit to Portuguese rule or the depredations of the Mbangala. Imagine this procession, a column of refugees and soldiers, making its way through the rugged interior of Angola, perhaps following little-known paths, crossing rivers, navigating forests and savannas. They would be vulnerable to attack, constantly on guard, facing shortages of food and water, and burdened by the grief of leaving their homes. Nzinga's leadership during this arduous trek would have been paramount, maintaining morale, ensuring discipline, making crucial decisions about routes and supplies. It was a test of her resilience and her ability to inspire loyalty even in the face of profound adversity. Their destination was the kingdom of Matamba. Matamba was another Mbundu-speaking state, located inland and to the east of Ndongo, in a region that was generally more mountainous, less accessible to Portuguese riverine penetration, and perhaps less directly impacted by the coastal slave trade at this early stage. Though certainly not immune to its reach, Matamba had its own distinct history and traditions. A particularly relevant quirk or fringe tidbit for Nzinga's story is that Matamba had a known tradition of female rulers, or at least a political system where women could wield significant power, sometimes even as queens regnant. This may have made it a more appealing or strategically viable destination for Nzinga, a queen seeking to establish or re-establish her authority. She wasn't just looking for a place to hide, she was looking for a place to rule, a new base from which to continue her struggle. The fact that Matamba already had precedents for female leadership might have smoothed her path, or at least provided a cultural framework within which her own queenship could be more readily accepted or asserted. Nzinga's arrival in Matamba was not necessarily a peaceful merger or a simple case of seeking asylum. While some sources suggest she may have had existing alliances or family connections there, or that parts of Matamba were already under some loose Ndongo influence, it's more likely that she had to conquer or assert her authority over the existing Matamba rulers or factions through a combination of military force and shrewd diplomacy. She was arriving with her own army of loyal Ndongo warriors, a formidable force in her own right, but she would have needed to either defeat any local opposition or persuade key Matamba leaders that aligning with her was in their best interest. This process of establishing her power in a new land would have been another period of intense struggle, requiring all her political and military skills. She wasn't just asking for a guest room, she was effectively staging a royal takeover. "Hello, Matamba," her envoys might have announced. "Queen Nzinga is here. She's looking for a new kingdom to run. We notice yours is available for dynamic new leadership. Don't worry, it'll be a very smooth transition. Mostly mainstream historical fact." After being driven from her Ndongo heartland by sustained Portuguese and Mbangala military campaigns around 1629-1630, Nzinga strategically retreated eastward and eventually conquered the Kingdom of Matamba, which she then transformed into a powerful military and commercial state, often serving as a refuge for those fleeing Portuguese oppression and the slave trade. This move was not just an escape, it was a calculated strategic repositioning. Once established in Matamba, Nzinga began the arduous process of consolidating her power and building a new, resilient state. This involved several key strategies. She needed to integrate her loyal Ndongo followers with the existing Matamba population, creating a unified political entity. She had to secure Matamba's borders against both Portuguese incursions from the west and potential threats from other neighboring African groups. And she needed to establish new economic foundations for her kingdom, perhaps by controlling inland trade routes that bypassed the Portuguese coastal monopoly, or by fostering local production. The precise nature of Nzinga's takeover and consolidation of power in Matamba, whether it was primarily a swift military conquest, a more gradual process of diplomatic alliance building that eventually evolved into her clear dominance, or a complex series of internal power struggles within Matamba that she skillfully exploited to her advantage, is not definitively clear from all surviving historical sources, which often present conflicting or incomplete perspectives. It was likely a messy, multifaceted process, characteristic of state formation in a turbulent era. This period of exile from Ndongo and the subsequent conquest and consolidation of Matamba marks a crucial turning point in Nzinga's career. It demonstrates her extraordinary adaptability, her refusal to accept defeat, and her strategic foresight. She had lost her ancestral kingdom, but instead of fading into obscurity or becoming a Portuguese puppet, she carved out a new domain, a new bastion of resistance, deep in the Angolan interior. Matamba, under Nzinga, would become a major thorn in the side of the Portuguese for decades to come, a symbol of African autonomy and a testament to the indomitable will of its warrior queen. The path of exile had led not to oblivion, but to a new, and in many ways even more formidable, throne. Queen Nzinga, having been forced from her ancestral kingdom of Ndongo, has successfully navigated the treacherous path of exile and, through a combination of military prowess and shrewd political maneuvering, has established herself as the ruler of the neighboring inland kingdom of Matamba. This isn't just a change of address. It's a strategic pivot, the founding of a new power base from which she will continue her decades-long struggle against Portuguese colonial ambitions and the horrors of the slave trade. The process of becoming Queen of Matamba and then consolidating her rule there, making it a formidable bastion of resistance, is a testament to her extraordinary leadership, her adaptability, and her unyielding determination. Let's settle in and observe how Nzinga transforms Matamba from a perhaps loosely organized inland state into a powerful military and commercial force, a haven for those fleeing oppression, and the new center of her ever-expanding influence. Upon securing her position as Queen of Matamba, likely in the early 1630s, Nzinga faced a host of immediate challenges. She was, in essence, an outsider who had seized power, albeit one with a significant retinue of loyal Ndongo warriors and followers. She needed to win over or subdue the indigenous Matamba nobility and populace, integrate her Ndongo people with the existing Matamba society, and create a unified, cohesive state capable of defending itself and projecting power. As Queen of Matamba, Nzinga skillfully transformed the kingdom into a formidable military and commercial power, achieving this by strategically integrating diverse populations, including her original Ndongo subjects, various Matamba groups, and even some defecting Imbangala warrior bands, and successfully resisting Portuguese colonial expansion for several decades. This wasn't just about military might, it was about sophisticated state building. One of her most significant and perhaps surprising strategies was her engagement with the Imbangala. These were the same highly militarized, often brutal warrior bands who had previously allied with the Portuguese and had been instrumental in driving Nzinga out of Ndongo. The Imbangala were known for their rejection of traditional agricultural life, their fierce initiation rites, their nomadic tendencies, and their effectiveness as soldiers. Instead of viewing all Imbangala as irredeemable enemies, Nzinga, in a display of remarkable pragmatism, recognized their military potential. She managed to forge alliances with some Imbangala groups, or perhaps even to defeat certain factions and incorporate their warriors into her own army. To do this, she reportedly adopted some of their military titles, underwent some of their initiation rituals, which, according to some accounts, were quite extreme and involved a symbolic rejection of traditional kinship ties and agricultural pursuits, and positioned herself as a powerful war leader in a manner that resonated with their own martial culture. This was a bold move, effectively turning a former threat into a new source of strength for her Matamba-based kingdom. It was like hiring the toughest security firm in town, even if they used to work for your main competitor, and then becoming their CEO. This military reorganization was crucial. Nzinga's army in Matamba became a diverse and formidable fighting force, combining the loyalty of her Ndongo veterans, the local strength of Matamba warriors, and the battle-hardened prowess of her new Imbangala allies. She understood that to resist the Portuguese and their firearms, she needed a highly mobile, disciplined, and motivated army. She also actively sought to acquire firearms herself, through trade perhaps with Dutch or other European rivals of the Portuguese, when opportunities arose or by capturing them in battle. Beyond military strength, Nzinga also focused on economic development and control of trade routes. Matamba, being further inland, was perhaps less directly accessible to Portuguese riverine trade than Ndongo had been. Nzinga sought to exploit this by establishing and controlling trade networks that could bypass Portuguese-dominated coastal areas. She aimed to make Matamba a key intermediary in the trade of goods like ivory, beeswax, and, yes, enslaved people, a grim reality of the era that even resistant African rulers were often enmeshed in, sometimes by capturing enemies or criminals, or by controlling the flow of captives from even further inland. By controlling these trade routes, Nzinga could generate wealth for her kingdom, acquire essential goods including weapons, and strengthen her political position. Her capital in Matamba became a bustling commercial hub, attracting traders from various regions. Looking for the best ivory deals in a kingdom that actively discourages Portuguese tax collectors. A trader might say, Queen Nzinga's Matamba is the place to be. Just don't mention you're a friend of the governor of Luanda. Social integration was another key aspect of her state building. Matamba under Nzinga became a haven for runaway slaves, fleeing Portuguese plantations, and for various other groups displaced by the constant warfare and slave raiding in the region. By welcoming these refugees and integrating them into her kingdom, Nzinga not only increased her population and manpower, but also burnished her reputation as a protector of African autonomy against colonial oppression. This created a diverse, multi-ethnic society in Matamba, united by loyalty to Nzinga and a shared opposition to Portuguese encroachment. Her ability to forge a common identity and purpose among these disparate groups was a mark of her exceptional leadership. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Nzinga's court in Matamba was said to have been a fascinating and somewhat syncretic blend of various cultural and ritual elements. She reportedly maintained many traditional Mbundu royal customs from Ndongo, but also incorporated Imbangala military titles and warrior rituals, and, as we'll see later, even engaged with European Christian forms when it suited her strategic purposes. This cultural flexibility and willingness to adapt and incorporate different traditions likely helped her to unify her diverse followers and project an image of unique, divinely sanctioned power. The extent to which Nzinga's adoption of Imbangala titles and certain notoriously harsh customs in Matamba represented a genuine cultural synthesis and personal transformation, versus a primarily pragmatic and perhaps even cynical political strategy to control and effectively utilize these formidable warrior bands for her own ends, is a topic of ongoing, nuanced discussion among historians of Central Africa. There are no simple answers when assessing the choices of a leader in such extreme circumstances. The boring but essential details of administration would also have occupied much of Nzinga's attention. Establishing a new royal capital, organizing provincial governance, ensuring food supplies, dispensing justice, managing tribute from subordinate chiefs, and maintaining communication across her realm. These were the everyday tasks of queenship, crucial for the stability and functioning of her new kingdom. While the warrior aspect of her reign is often highlighted, this behind-the-scenes work of state building was equally vital to Matamba's success as a resilient bastion against colonial power. Under Nzinga's rule, Matamba was not just a kingdom of refuge, it became a kingdom of active resistance, a powerful military and political force that the Portuguese could not ignore and often could not defeat. She had turned exile into opportunity, transforming a neighboring state into the new heart of her lifelong struggle for autonomy and the protection of her people. The Queen of Ndongo was now, definitively, the Queen of Matamba as well, and her new bastion was ready to face the storms ahead. Queen Nzinga has successfully transformed Matamba into a formidable bastion of resistance, a new power base from which to continue her lifelong struggle against Portuguese colonial ambitions in West Central Africa. Her military has been reorganized, her economy is developing through control of inland trade routes, and her kingdom has become a haven for those fleeing oppression. But the Portuguese are a relentless foe, part of a vast global empire. And Nzinga, for all her strategic brilliance and personal courage, knows that fighting them alone indefinitely is a daunting prospect. She is a pragmatist, always looking for an advantage, a way to shift the balance of power. And in the mid-17th century, a new, unexpected opportunity arises on the wider colonial stage, the arrival of another European power in the region, one that is a direct rival to Portugal, the Dutch. Nzinga's decision to ally with these newcomers marks a significant new chapter in her reign, a bold attempt to leverage inter-European rivalries to her own advantage and perhaps, just perhaps, decisively turn the tide against her Portuguese nemesis. To understand this development, we need to briefly zoom out to the wider colonial context of the 1630s and 1640s. Portugal, which had enjoyed a near monopoly on European trade and colonization along much of the West African coast and in the South Atlantic slave trade for over a century, was now facing increasing competition from other rising European maritime powers. The Dutch Republic, in particular, having recently gained its own independence from Spain, with which Portugal was united under the Iberian Union from 1580 to 1640, was emerging as a global commercial and naval powerhouse. The Dutch West India Company, chartered in 1621, was an aggressive instrument of this expansion, tasked with challenging Portuguese and Spanish dominance in the Americas and Africa, capturing their trade routes, and establishing Dutch colonies and trading posts. They were particularly interested in disrupting the lucrative sugar trade from Brazil and the associated slave trade from Africa. "There's a new colonial sheriff in town," the Dutch might have declared. And they're serving eviction notices to the Portuguese, preferably with a side of hefty profit margins. This global rivalry had direct consequences for Angola. In August 1641, a powerful Dutch fleet, under the command of Admiral Cornelis Jool, nicknamed Houtabin or Pegleg, sailed into the harbor of Luanda, the Portuguese colonial capital of Angola, and captured it with relative ease. The Portuguese governor and much of the colonial administration were forced to flee inland, to fortified positions like Masangano. This was a stunning blow to Portuguese prestige and control in the region. For Nzinga, watching these events unfold from her kingdom of Matamba, the Dutch capture of Luanda must have seemed like a heaven-sent opportunity, or at least a very promising geopolitical development. The enemy of her enemy, as the old adage goes, could indeed be her friend, or at least a very useful temporary ally. Queen Nzinga strategically and decisively allied herself with the Dutch shortly after they captured Luanda in 1641, seeing them as a powerful counterweight to the Portuguese, and a means to bolster her own military campaigns aimed at driving the Portuguese out of Angola and regaining her ancestral lands in Ndongo. This wasn't just a passive alliance, it was an active military and political partnership. Nzinga sent envoys to the Dutch commanders in Luanda, offering her support and proposing joint operations against their common Portuguese foe. The Dutch, for their part, recognized Nzinga as a powerful and influential African ruler, a valuable ally in their own struggle to consolidate their hold on Luanda and disrupt Portuguese trade. They likely supplied her with some firearms, ammunition, and perhaps even military advisors, though the extent of this material support is debated. What followed was a period of intensified warfare against the Portuguese, who were now caught between the Dutch on the coast and Nzinga's formidable Matamba forces in the interior. Nzinga launched several major campaigns, sometimes in coordination with Dutch expeditions. Her warriors, perhaps emboldened by their new European allies and any additional weaponry they provided, fought with renewed vigor. There were significant battles, sieges of Portuguese forts like Masangano, Ambaca, and Muxima, and a general rollback of Portuguese influence in many areas. Nzinga herself, true to her warrior queen persona, often led her troops in these campaigns. Her reputation for fierceness and strategic cunning growing ever larger. It must have been a period of great hope for her and her followers, a chance to finally expel the Portuguese and restore full autonomy to the Mbundu kingdoms. All right, my Dutch comrades in arms. Nzinga might have strategized. If you bring the fancy ships and the slightly damp gunpowder, I'll bring the battle-hardened warriors who actually know how to fight in this terrain without complaining about the humidity. Together, we shall make the Portuguese wish they'd stuck to cod fishing. The nature of this alliance, however, was likely always pragmatic and based on mutual self-interest rather than any deep cultural understanding or shared long-term vision. Nzinga wanted the Portuguese gone and her own power consolidated. The Dutch wanted to secure Luanda as a trading post, especially for slaves, as they too were now heavily involved in supplying plantations in Brazil, which they had partially conquered from the Portuguese, and to weaken their main European rival in the South Atlantic. There would have been cultural clashes, misunderstandings, and perhaps underlying mistrust between the Mbundu queen and her new European partners. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that during her alliance with the Dutch, Nzinga reportedly sent them gifts of provisions, such as cattle, to support their garrison in Luanda, and her warriors fought alongside Dutch soldiers, sometimes even adopting or adapting certain European military tactics or formations they observed from their new allies. This shows a level of practical cooperation and Nzinga's willingness to learn and adapt, even from very different military traditions. For several years, from 1641 to 1648, this Nzinga-Dutch alliance put immense pressure on the Portuguese in Angola. Nzinga managed to reconquer significant parts of Ndongo and reassert her influence over many Mbundu chiefs who had previously submitted to Portugal. It seemed as though her lifelong struggle might finally be tipping in her favor. However, the global geopolitical tides were shifting once more. In 1640, Portugal had regained its independence from Spain, ending the Iberian Union. Freed from Spanish entanglements, the Portuguese crown was determined to reclaim its lost colonial possessions, including those in Brazil and Angola. In 1648, a powerful Portuguese fleet and army, dispatched from Brazil under the command of Salvador Correia de Sá e Benavides, arrived off Luanda and, after a determined siege, recaptured the city from the Dutch. The Dutch, overstretched and perhaps less committed to Angola than to their Brazilian holdings, were forced to withdraw. The Dutch departure from Luanda in 1648 was a severe blow to Nzinga. Her most powerful European ally was gone, and the Portuguese were back in control of the coast, stronger and more determined than ever to crush her resistance. She was once again facing her old enemy, but this time without the direct support of another European power. The 7 years of the Dutch alliance had been a period of significant success and renewed hope for Nzinga, a time when she had truly shifted the colonial tides. Now, she would have to adapt her strategies yet again, drawing on all her resilience and diplomatic skill to face a resurgent Portuguese threat. The game of colonial chess was far from over, but one of Nzinga's key pieces had just been swept from the board: the true depth and long-term strategic aims of Nzinga's alliance with the Dutch. Whether she envisioned a permanent, power-sharing partnership, saw it primarily as a temporary, opportunistic measure to decisively weaken the Portuguese before perhaps turning on the Dutch themselves, or simply hoped it would lead to a more balanced and respectful relationship with at least one European power, are interpreted variously by historians based on the available, often fragmented, evidence in her subsequent diplomatic and military actions. What is certain is that for a brief, shining period, she had managed to brilliantly exploit inter-imperial rivalries to further her own kingdom's fight for survival and autonomy. The Dutch interlude in Luanda, from 1641 to 1648, had offered Queen Nzinga a powerful, if temporary, European ally against her primary adversary, the Portuguese. For 7 years, she had leveraged this alliance to push back Portuguese forces, reclaim territory, and strengthen her own position as the undisputed ruler of Matamba and a claimant to the throne of Ndongo. But now, with the Portuguese restoration in Luanda, that advantageous dynamic has shifted. The Dutch are gone, and Nzinga once again faces a reinvigorated, determined Portuguese colonial power, eager to reassert its dominance and punish those who had collaborated with its European rivals. This new phase of her reign, stretching through the late 1640s and into the 1650s, would demand all of Nzinga's considerable diplomatic acumen, her military resilience, and her ability to play a complex, multi-layered global game on the chessboard of colonial West Central Africa. It was a time for astute maneuvering, for forging new alliances where possible, and for never, ever underestimating her opponents, or allowing them to underestimate her. With the direct military support of the Dutch removed, Nzinga understood that relying solely on armed resistance against the full might of the Portuguese in Angola might be a path to eventual, if heroic, destruction. While she certainly didn't abandon her military preparedness, Matamba remained a formidable fighting force. She increasingly turned to diplomacy as a key instrument of statecraft. Her goal was not just survival, but the preservation of her kingdom's autonomy and the security of her people. This required a delicate balancing act. Queen Nzinga was a remarkably skilled diplomat who engaged in complex negotiations with multiple European powers, primarily the Portuguese, but also having dealt with the Dutch and various neighboring African groups throughout her long and turbulent reign, constantly adapting her strategies to protect her kingdom's sovereignty and commercial interests. Her primary diplomatic antagonists, and sometimes uneasy negotiating partners, remained the Portuguese in Luanda. The relationship was one of deep-seated mistrust and decades of bitter warfare, yet both sides also recognized, at times, the potential benefits of temporary truces or even more formal peace agreements. The Portuguese needed relative stability to ensure the flow of trade, especially slaves from the interior. A grim reality Nzinga herself had to navigate and sometimes participate in, often by selling captives taken from her enemies. Nzinga, for her part, needed periods of peace to allow her kingdom to recover from war, to consolidate her internal power, to foster agriculture, and to engage in trade on more favorable terms. So, despite the ongoing hostility, channels of communication often remained open. Nzinga would send envoys to Luanda, Portuguese governors would send emissaries, or more often stern demands, to her court in Matamba. These negotiations would have been incredibly complex, filled with protocol, veiled threats, intricate bargaining, and the constant shadow of potential treachery. Imagine Nzinga's negotiators, carefully chosen for their intelligence and loyalty, trying to parry Portuguese demands for submission or tribute, while subtly probing for weaknesses or divisions within the colonial administration. "Yes, Governor," her envoy might say with a polite but firm smile. "Her Majesty Queen Nzinga appreciates your generous offer of protection. However, she currently feels her own very large army provides quite adequate security. Perhaps we could discuss the price of ivory instead, and the return of those royal blacksmiths you accidentally captured last season." Nzinga was astute enough to understand the broader geopolitical context. While the Dutch had been forced out of Angola, they, along with other European powers like the English and the French, were still active elsewhere on the African coast and in the Atlantic world, constantly challenging Portuguese and Spanish dominance. The extent to which Nzinga actively sought or managed to establish direct diplomatic or commercial ties with these other European powers after the Dutch departure from Luanda is a subject that historians continue to analyze and debate, with direct evidence being somewhat elusive for sustained, independent relationships beyond opportunistic trade. However, her awareness of these inter-European rivalries would certainly have informed her strategy. She knew the Portuguese were not the only European game in town, and the possibility, however remote, of playing one European power off against another, or at least using the threat of such an alliance, could be a useful diplomatic tool. Her correspondence with the Vatican in her later years, seeking papal recognition and support, can also be seen as part of this broader strategy to gain international legitimacy and leverage against Portuguese colonial claims. It was a 17th century African version of "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," or at least a useful temporary acquaintance who might sell me some decent muskets. A crucial aspect of her diplomatic toolkit, especially in her dealings with Europeans, was her Christian identity. Having been baptized as Dona Ana de Souza back in 1622, she could, when it suited her, present herself as a fellow Christian monarch, appealing to shared religious values or seeking the intervention of missionaries or church authorities. This often complicated the Portuguese position. It was harder to justify relentless warfare against a baptized Christian queen, at least in the eyes of Rome or other Catholic powers. Nzinga was a master at using this religious identity strategically, sometimes emphasizing her piety to gain diplomatic advantage. At other times, perhaps allowing traditional Mbundu religious practices to flourish in her kingdom when it suited her internal political needs. Her faith was likely a complex tapestry of genuine belief, cultural inheritance, and shrewd political calculation. Her diplomatic efforts weren't confined to Europeans. Maintaining and forging alliances with other African states and chiefdoms was equally, if not more, important for Matamba's security and prosperity. The political landscape of West Central Africa was a mosaic of kingdoms, some large, some small, with constantly shifting loyalties and rivalries. Nzinga had to be a skilled negotiator with her African neighbors, forming defensive pacts, securing trade agreements, or, sometimes, engaging in regional power struggles to ensure Matamba's dominance or protect its borders from other expanding African polities or predatory Mbangala bands that weren't allied with her. Her ability to unify diverse Mbundu and even non-Mbundu groups under her leadership in Matamba was a testament to her diplomatic and political skills within an African context. A quirky or fringe tidbit often mentioned in relation to Nzinga's diplomatic prowess is the claim, found in some later accounts or perhaps rooted in oral tradition, that she was a master of languages, fluent not only in her native Kimbundu but also in Portuguese, and perhaps possessing some understanding of other local dialects or even a smattering of Dutch from her alliance period. While the full extent of her linguistic abilities is hard to verify, her successful decades of negotiation with diverse groups certainly suggest a sharp intellect and excellent communication skills, whether directly or through trusted interpreters. It's also said she sent envoys, perhaps even some of her own relatives, not just to European colonial outposts in Africa, but according to some more speculative accounts, she may have harbored ambitions or made attempts to make direct contact with royal courts in Europe or with the papacy, seeking broader international recognition or support for her cause. This would have been an incredibly audacious move for a 17th century African ruler. Imagine Nzinga, in her royal court at Matamba, receiving envoys, dictating letters once she learned to use scribes for Portuguese correspondence, weighing intelligence reports and planning her next move on this vast, dangerous chessboard. Each decision, whether to offer a concession to the Portuguese, to send a military expedition against a troublesome neighbor, to welcome a new group of refugees into her kingdom, or to dispatch a secret message to a potential ally, was part of this ongoing global game. She was a queen playing for the highest stakes, the survival of her people and the independence of her kingdom, against some of the most powerful imperial forces of her day. Her long reign is a testament to just how well she played that game. Queen Nzinga's long and tumultuous reign was a masterclass in military resilience and shrewd diplomatic maneuvering. We've seen her navigate the treacherous currents of colonial power plays, even forming a temporary alliance with the Dutch to counter the Portuguese. But there's another significant and often debated dimension to her strategy and her personal journey: her relationship with Christianity. Nzinga was first baptized in Luanda in 1622, taking the name Dona Ana de Souza, an event that occurred during her famous diplomatic mission and was likely driven, at least in part, by political pragmatism. However, her engagement with Christianity didn't end there. In her later years, particularly after the Dutch withdrawal from Angola, and as she sought a more lasting peace with Portugal, Nzinga re-embraced the Christian faith, this time with a more public and sustained commitment, even welcoming Capuchin missionaries to her kingdom of Matamba. Let's gently explore these baptismal waters and ponder the complex interplay of faith and strategy in the life of this remarkable African queen. To understand Nzinga's later, more formal reconversion to Christianity, we need to consider the context of the mid-17th century in Angola. The Portuguese, having reclaimed Luanda in 1648, were once again the dominant European power in the region, and their colonial project was deeply intertwined with the Catholic Church. For the Portuguese, Christianization of African populations was often seen as a tool of assimilation, a way to pacify heathen peoples, and a justification for their colonial presence. They often favored Christianized African leaders, believing sometimes mistakenly that they would be more pliable or more aligned with Portuguese interests. Queen Nzinga formally reconverted to Christianity in her later years, a process culminating around 1656 when she welcomed Italian Capuchin missionaries to her capital in Matamba and engaged in direct correspondence with the Pope in Rome. This move had undeniably significant political and diplomatic implications in her ongoing efforts to secure peace and legitimacy for her kingdoms. What were Nzinga's motivations for this later? More pronounced embrace of Christianity. It was likely a complex tapestry woven from several threads. Political and diplomatic expediency certainly played a major role. By formally adopting Christianity, by building churches, by supporting missionary activity, and by corresponding with the Pope. Nzinga was signaling to the Portuguese and to the wider European world that she was a civilized Christian monarch, not a pagan barbarian. This could, and did, improve her standing in negotiations with the Portuguese. It made it harder for them to justify continuous warfare against her on religious grounds. It provided a shared framework of belief and ritual within which diplomacy could be conducted. It might also have been a way to seek allies or mediators within the Catholic Church itself, perhaps hoping for papal intervention to restrain Portuguese excesses. Look, Governor, her envoys might argue, Her Most Christian Majesty Queen, Dona Ana de Sousa of Matamba, merely requests that you stop trying to enslave her entire congregation. It's making Sunday services very poorly attended. But was it only about politics? Some historians and missionary accounts suggest that Nzinga's later engagement with Christianity might also have involved elements of genuine personal or spiritual conviction. She was, by this time, an aging ruler, having witnessed decades of brutal warfare, immense suffering, and profound loss, including, according to tradition, her own son and sisters at various points. It's plausible that in her later years she found some solace, some meaning, or some intellectual appeal in Christian teachings. The Capuchin missionaries who resided at her court, particularly figures like Father Antonio Cavazzi, wrote extensively about her piety, her diligence in learning Christian doctrine, her participation in Mass, and her efforts to promote the faith among her people. While these missionary accounts must be read with an understanding of their own religious agenda, they were keen to highlight successful conversions of prominent rulers. They do paint a picture of a queen who seemed to take her adopted faith seriously, at least in its outward observances. Perhaps the promise of salvation, or the idea of a powerful, universal God, resonated with her in her old age. Or maybe she just really enjoyed a good theological debate, and the missionaries were the only ones around who could keep up. Another strategic consideration could have been state building and unification. Matamba, under Nzinga, was a diverse kingdom, composed of her original Ndongo followers, indigenous Matamba peoples, various refugee groups, and even former Imbangala warriors. Adopting Christianity as a state religion, or at least giving it a prominent official status, might have been seen by Nzinga as a way to create a new, unifying ideology for her realm, one that could transcend older ethnic or political divisions. It could also project an image of Matamba as a more modern or legitimate kingdom in the eyes of the Europeans with whom she had to deal. However, Nzinga's embrace of Christianity was rarely a simple or straightforward adoption of European norms. She was known for her syncretic approach, often blending Christian practices with existing Mbundu religious beliefs and rituals. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Nzinga reportedly had a church built in her royal capital in Matamba, and insisted on being buried with full Christian rites. Yet she also continued to honor many Mbundu ancestral traditions and consult with traditional diviners and spiritual leaders, showcasing a complex and perhaps pragmatic integration of different belief systems. She didn't necessarily see them as mutually exclusive. For her, power and spirituality could flow from multiple sources. She might attend Mass in the morning and then participate in a traditional Mbundu ceremony in the afternoon, seeing no inherent contradiction, much to the occasional consternation of the more doctrinaire Capuchin fathers. Your Majesty, a missionary might gently chide, while your devotion to building this magnificent church is commendable, perhaps the sacred crocodile of the River Kwanzaa doesn't also need a new shrine right next to the baptistry. Her interactions with the missionaries themselves are fascinating. Nzinga was no passive recipient of their teachings. She was an intelligent, questioning, and often challenging convert. Missionary letters describe her engaging them in long theological discussions, questioning points of doctrine, and demanding clear explanations. She controlled the terms of their presence in her kingdom, ensuring that their activities served her broader political and social goals. She used them as scribes for her correspondence with the Portuguese and with Rome, as diplomatic intermediaries, and as symbols of her Christian piety to the outside world. But she also protected them and seemed to genuinely value the learning and perhaps the spiritual counsel some of them offered. The depth and nature of Queen Nzinga's personal Christian faith in her later years, as distinct from its undeniable political utility in her complex dealings with the Portuguese colonial administration and her direct appeals to Rome, remain a subject of considerable historical interpretation and ongoing theological reflection among scholars. Was she a true believer who found solace and meaning in the Christian message? Was she a master strategist who expertly wielded religion as a tool of statecraft? Or, most likely, was she a complex combination of both, a leader whose spiritual journey was inextricably intertwined with the political survival of her people and her kingdom? Her decision to re-embrace Christianity, particularly her alliance with the Capuchin missionaries, was a significant move in the later stages of her reign. It helped to pave the way for the peace treaty she eventually signed with the Portuguese, and it shaped the image of her and her kingdom that was transmitted to Europe. The baptismal waters, for Nzinga, were not just about spiritual cleansing. They were also a deep and strategic dive into the complex currents of 17th century global politics and religion. Queen Nzinga has navigated decades of relentless warfare, complex diplomatic chess games, and even a profound engagement with a new European religion. She has led armies, forged and broken alliances, and transformed her kingdom of Matamba into a formidable bastion of resistance and a haven for those fleeing colonial oppression. Now, as she enters her later years, likely into her 60s and 70s in the 1650s and early 1660s, the fires of constant battle begin to bank. Though they never truly go out, her focus, increasingly, shifts towards securing a lasting peace for her people, consolidating the gains she has made, and ensuring the future stability and survival of her hard-won kingdoms. This is Nzinga, the elder stateswoman, a figure of immense experience and still formidable will, working to forge a lasting legacy beyond the battlefield. After a lifetime of almost continuous conflict, the desire for peace, for a measure of stability, must have weighed heavily on Nzinga and her people. Matamba, and the parts of Ndongo she still claimed or influenced, had endured immense suffering: depopulation due to the slave trade, disruption of agriculture, the constant strain of warfare. While Nzinga had proven herself an indomitable military leader, she was also a shrewd realist. She understood that perpetual war with the Portuguese, even if fought to a stalemate, was a drain on her resources and a constant threat to her subjects' well-being. Her re-embrace of Christianity and her welcoming of Capuchin missionaries in the mid-1650s can be seen, in part, as a crucial diplomatic prelude to achieving a more durable peace with the Portuguese, who were themselves perhaps growing weary of the costly and often inconclusive wars against her. Perhaps she might have mused to her council. If we talk about salvation and baptisms a bit more, they'll be less inclined to talk about slave quotas and military expeditions. It's worth a try. At my age, one prefers theological debates to trench warfare. Mostly. The culmination of these later diplomatic efforts was the negotiation of a formal peace treaty with the Portuguese. This was a long and complex process, involving numerous exchanges of envoys, intricate bargaining, and the careful navigation of mutual suspicions built up over decades of conflict. Finally, in her final years, Queen Nzinga successfully negotiated a significant peace treaty with the Portuguese, which was formally ratified around 1656 or 1657. This treaty largely recognized her sovereignty over Matamba, established defined borders, though these would remain contentious, and included provisions for trade, effectively bringing a period of relative stability to the region after nearly 40 years of her leadership in war and diplomacy. This was a monumental achievement for Nzinga. While it likely involved concessions on both sides, and didn't end all Portuguese ambitions in the region, it provided her kingdom with a crucial breathing space and a degree of official recognition from her most powerful adversary. It was a testament to her diplomatic skill, her persistence, and her ability to adapt her strategies even in old age. She had fought them to a standstill, and now she had negotiated them to a peace, largely on her own terms regarding Matamba's autonomy. With a measure of external peace secured, Nzinga could focus more on the internal consolidation of her kingdom of Matamba. This was the boring but essential work of peacetime governance that often gets overlooked in tales of warrior queens. She needed to strengthen the institutions of her state, ensure the loyalty of her diverse population, which included her original Ndongo followers, various Matamba groups, former Imbangala warriors, and refugees from Portuguese-controlled areas, and promote economic recovery. This might involve fostering agriculture to ensure food security, encouraging trade through Matamba's inland routes now, perhaps with more formal agreements with the Portuguese regarding coastal access or specific commodities, and dispensing justice to maintain internal order. She would have continued to rely on her trusted advisors, including her sisters, who had been her steadfast allies throughout her long struggles. A major concern for any aging ruler, especially one who had forged a kingdom through personal charisma and military prowess, was the question of succession. Nzinga, as we know, had no surviving direct children, her son, according to tradition, having been killed by her brother years before. This meant she had to carefully groom and designate an heir to ensure that Matamba would not descend into chaos or become vulnerable to Portuguese manipulation after her death. Her sisters, Kafunji and Mukambu, who had also been baptized, taking Christian names, with Mukambu becoming known as Dona Barbara, were her closest kin and most loyal supporters. It was to her sister Mukambu Dona Barbara that Nzinga eventually looked to secure the succession. She would have spent considerable effort trying to ensure that this choice was accepted by the various factions within Matamba and, importantly, recognized by the Portuguese to prevent them from trying to install their own puppet ruler after she was gone. Her continued practice of Christianity in these later years also played a role in her statecraft. By maintaining good relations with the Capuchin missionaries, building churches, a central one was constructed in her capital, and encouraging, or at least not hindering, the spread of Christianity among her people. She reinforced her image as a Christian monarch to the outside world, particularly to Portugal and Rome. This provided a degree of diplomatic legitimacy and perhaps some protection. However, she also remained deeply connected to Mbundu traditions. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that, even in her old age, while outwardly a devout Christian queen, corresponding with the Pope, Nzinga was said by some missionary observers to still retain certain traditional Mbundu spiritual advisors or engage in practices that seemed to blend Christian and indigenous beliefs. She was a master of navigating these different spiritual worlds, using them both to her advantage. For instance, missionaries like Father Kavazi described her engaging in intense theological debates with them, showing her active, intelligent engagement with her adopted faith rather than just passive or superficial acceptance. She wasn't just going through the motions, she was thinking, questioning, and integrating. The long-term success and ultimate stability of the peace treaty Nzinga negotiated with the Portuguese, and its actual impact on curbing the devastating slave trade in her region versus merely redirecting its routes or allowing her to manage Matamba's participation in it on more favorable terms, are complex historical outcomes that are assessed differently by historians, depending on the evidence they prioritize and their interpretative frameworks. Peace was always fragile, and the Portuguese appetite for slaves remained. But for the remainder of Nzinga's reign, Matamba experienced a period of relative calm and consolidation, a testament to her efforts as an elder stateswoman. Imagine Nzinga in these final years no longer always leading armies into battle, but still a formidable presence. Her mind sharp, her will unbroken. She is focused on securing the future, on ensuring that the kingdom she had fought so hard to build and protect would endure beyond her lifetime. It was a different kind of battle now, fought with treaties, alliances, and the careful grooming of a successor, but no less crucial for the survival of her people. The warrior queen was now also the architect of a fragile peace, a legacy she hoped would last. Queen Nzinga, the indomitable ruler of Ndongo and Matamba, has navigated a lifetime of war, diplomacy, exile, and state building. She has faced down Portuguese governors, allied with Dutch admirals, outmaneuvered internal rivals, and transformed her kingdom of Matamba into a resilient bastion of African autonomy. Now, in the early 1660s, she is an old woman, likely around 80 years of age, an extraordinary lifespan for anyone in the 17th century, let alone for a monarch who had spent so much of her life on the battlefield or in the equally perilous arena of colonial politics. As the sun begins to set on her long and momentous reign, Nzinga's thoughts would undoubtedly turn to the future, to the succession, and to the enduring anxieties about the survival of her people and the legacy she would leave behind. Let's gently approach these final years, witnessing the sunset of a queen and the profound challenges that lay ahead for her kingdoms. Imagine Nzinga in her royal capital in Matamba. The fire of her youth may have banked, but her mind remains sharp, her presence commanding. She has achieved a measure of peace with the Portuguese through the Treaty of 1656-57, and her kingdom is relatively stable. But she knows this stability is fragile, heavily dependent on her own personal authority, and the complex web of alliances and understandings she has painstakingly built over decades. Mainstream historical fact: Queen Nzinga died in December 1663 at an advanced age estimated to be around 80 years old, having designated her sister Dona Barbara Mukambu as her successor to the throne of Matamba. After a reign of nearly 4 decades characterized by relentless resistance and astute diplomacy, her paramount concern in these final years would have been succession. Who would and could effectively rule Matamba and continue her policies after she was gone? Nzinga had no surviving direct children to inherit her throne. Her son, according to tradition, had been killed decades earlier, a victim of her brother N'Gola Mbande's paranoia or cruelty. This lack of a direct heir in a society where lineage was important, though not always rigidly defined, presented a significant challenge. She needed a successor who was not only loyal to her vision, but also strong enough to hold together the diverse factions within Matamba, her Ndongo followers. The indigenous Matamba groups, former Mbangala warriors and capable of navigating the ever-present threat from the Portuguese. Her closest and most trusted allies throughout much of her reign had been her sisters, Kafunji Dona Graça and Mukambu Dona Barbara. These women had shared her exiles, her battles, and her political struggles. It was to her sister Mukambu, who had also converted to Christianity and taken the name Dona Barbara, that Nzinga ultimately turned to secure the succession. Designating Dona Barbara as her heir was a logical choice in many ways. She was of royal blood, experienced in the ways of the court and statecraft, and presumably shared Nzinga's commitment to Matamba's independence. Nzinga would have spent considerable effort in her final years trying to ensure that this choice was accepted by the powerful nobles and military leaders within Matamba, and also, crucially, trying to get the Portuguese to formally recognize Dona Barbara as her legitimate successor. This was vital, as the Portuguese had a long history of interfering in succession disputes in African kingdoms to install rulers more favorable to their own interests. Nzinga wanted to leave behind a clear line of succession, not a power vacuum that her enemies could exploit. All right, Dona Barbara. Nzinga might have advised her sister, "The kingdom is yours. Try not to let the Portuguese convince you that trading our entire treasury for a slightly used musket and a promise of friendship is a good deal. I've made that mistake once or twice. Learn from my extensive experience." As her health declined, Nzinga's engagement with her Christian faith, particularly her relationship with the Capuchin missionaries at her court, seems to have deepened, or at least become more publicly pronounced. A quirky or fringe tidbit drawn from the detailed accounts left by these missionaries like Father Antonio Cavazzi, who knew her well in her later years, is that Nzinga, even on her deathbed, expressed anxieties about the future of her kingdom and the continuation of the Christian faith within it. She reportedly gave very specific instructions for her burial according to Christian rites, including being interred in the habit of the Capuchin order, and made provisions for the ongoing support of the missionaries and the church she had established in Matamba. This shows her continued active engagement with both spiritual and political matters until the very end. She was clearly thinking about her legacy, not just in this world, but perhaps in the next, and also about how her choices would be perceived by the European powers she still had to contend with. Even in death, her final illness and death in December 1663 marked the end of an extraordinary era. For nearly 40 years, Nzinga had been the dominant figure in the region, a symbol of resistance, a brilliant strategist, and a queen who had not only survived but often thrived against seemingly insurmountable odds. Her passing would have been met with profound grief by her loyal followers in Matamba, who had known her as their protector and leader for generations. The missionaries would have mourned the loss of their royal patroness. Even the Portuguese and Luandas who had fought her for so long must have acknowledged the departure of a truly formidable adversary. A great tree had fallen in the forest, and its absence would be keenly felt. The immediate aftermath of Nzinga's death would have been a period of uncertainty and potential instability. Did her chosen successor, Dona Barbara, manage to hold on to power smoothly? The stability and continuity of Nzinga's political and social structures in Matamba immediately following her death, particularly under the rule of her sister Dona Barbara, and the extent to which Portuguese influence attempted to reassert itself or internal factions sought to challenge the new queen, are complex subjects that historians of 17th century Anglan history continue to research and analyze. While Dona Barbara did rule for a time, the history of Matamba after Nzinga was often characterized by further succession struggles and ongoing conflicts. Maintaining the unified, powerful state that Nzinga had forged was no easy task for her successors. Nzinga's anxieties about the future were well-founded. She had dedicated her entire adult life to a relentless struggle for the autonomy of her people and the integrity of her kingdoms. She had used every tool at her disposal: warfare, diplomacy, strategic alliances, religious conversion, and her own indomitable will. But she also knew that the forces of colonialism were persistent and powerful, and that the internal cohesion of an African kingdom could be fragile, especially during a transfer of power. Would her life's work endure? Would Matamba remain a bastion of independence? Would the peace she had so painstakingly negotiated hold? These are the questions that likely filled her mind in her final days. The anxieties of a queen who had carried the weight of her people's destiny for so long. The sun was setting on her reign, and the shadows of uncertainty for the future of Matamba were undoubtedly lengthening. Queen Nzinga Mbande, the warrior diplomat, the astute politician, the symbol of resistance, has breathed her last in her kingdom of Matamba, around the year 1663 after a reign spanning nearly 4 extraordinary decades. Her funeral, likely a complex blend of the Christian rites she had requested and the deep-seated Mbundu royal traditions she embodied, marks the end of a monumental life. But Nzinga's story, her impact, doesn't simply conclude with her death. Her legacy, like a great river, continued to flow, shaping the history of Angola, inspiring future generations, and eventually earning her a place as an enduring icon of African agency and anti-colonial struggle. Let's gently reflect on this Nzinga's echo, the ways in which her life and actions resonated long after she was laid to rest. In the immediate aftermath of her death, her designated successor, her sister Dona Barbara Mukambu, did indeed take the throne of Matamba. However, as Nzinga likely feared, maintaining the kingdom's stability and fending off Portuguese ambitions without Nzinga's unique personal authority and strategic genius proved challenging. Matamba continued to exist as an independent or semi-independent state for a considerable time, a testament to the strong foundations Nzinga had built, but it faced ongoing pressures and internal succession disputes. The peace Nzinga had negotiated with the Portuguese was often tested, and the slave trade, though perhaps managed differently under Nzinga's direct control, remained a devastating force in the region. Her dream of a fully autonomous, secure Mbundu heartland remained an ongoing struggle for her successors. What was Nzinga's reputation among the Europeans of her time, and in the centuries immediately following, it was, not surprisingly, a complex and often contradictory one. To the Portuguese officials and soldiers who had fought her for decades, she was often portrayed as a formidable, cunning, and barbarous enemy, an Amazon queen whose military prowess and defiance were both grudgingly respected and deeply feared. Some missionary accounts, particularly those from the Capuchins who knew her in her later Christian years, painted a more nuanced picture, acknowledging her intelligence, her regal bearing, and what they perceived as her genuine piety, even as they detailed her exotic court customs or her past as a heathen warrior. For many Europeans, she became a larger-than-life, almost mythical figure, embodying the perceived savagery and dangerous allure of Africa, or alternatively, a notable example of a powerful female ruler in a world dominated by men. Her story was sensational, and it was retold in Europe with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment, often emphasizing her more warlike or unconventional attributes. Did you hear about Queen Nzinga? A European courtier might whisper. They say she leads armies, keeps a harem of men, and negotiates treaties with the Pope. Quite the character, definitely not inviting her to our next croquet match. Though, too intense. It was much later, particularly in the 20th century with the rise of African nationalism and the movements for independence from colonial rule, that Nzinga was rediscovered and reevaluated as a heroic figure, a powerful symbol of anti-colonial resistance and indigenous African leadership. For Angolans fighting for their own freedom from Portuguese rule in the 1960s and 70s, Nzinga became an inspirational icon, her centuries-long struggle against the same colonial power resonating deeply with their own aspirations. She was no longer just a barbarous queen from a distant past. She was a national hero, a foremother of Angolan independence. Mainstream. Historical fact. Queen Nzinga Mbande is remembered today as a powerful symbol of African resistance to European colonialism, a skilled military leader, and a shrewd diplomat. And she is officially recognized as a national hero in modern Angola, with statues, streets, and even currency bearing her image or name. What does Nzinga symbolize today? Beyond Angola. Her story has increasingly gained international recognition. She represents resistance against oppression. Her decades-long fight against a vastly more powerful colonial empire is a timeless tale of courage and defiance, female empowerment and leadership. In an era when female rulers were rare and often underestimated, Nzinga not only ruled but led armies, conducted diplomacy, and built a state challenging patriarchal norms both within her own society and in her dealings with Europeans. Diplomatic skill and political astuteness. Her ability to navigate complex alliances, play European powers against each other, and negotiate from positions of weakness was extraordinary. Cultural resilience and adaptation. She was a master of syncretism, blending Imbanu traditions with elements from Imbangala warrior culture and European Christianity to forge a unique and effective political and personal identity. African agency. Her life powerfully refutes the old colonial narrative of Africans as passive victims of European expansion. Nzinga was an active agent, shaping her own destiny and the destiny of her people, constantly making choices, taking risks, and fighting for her vision. The boring history aspects of her life, which we've tried to gently explore, are also crucial to understanding her true greatness. Her story isn't just about dramatic battles or legendary confrontations like the human chair incident. It's also about the decades of patient state building, the complex administration of a diverse kingdom, the logistical challenges of supplying armies and feeding populations, the endless, often frustrating process of diplomacy and negotiation, and the sheer day-to-day endurance required to lead in a time of unceasing crisis. It's these less glamorous, more boring details that reveal the true depth of her leadership and the scale of her achievements. A quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights her enduring cultural significance is that in the 1970s, during Angola's struggle for independence, a major avenue in the capital city of Luanda was renamed Rua Rainha Nzinga, Queen Nzinga Street, in her honor. She has also been featured on Angolan currency and postage stamps, and there are statues of her in Angola, cementing her place as a foundational figure in the nation's identity. Her story continues to be told and retold, inspiring artists, writers, and activists. The ongoing reinterpretation of Queen Nzinga's legacy, whether she is viewed primarily as a heroic nationalist anti-colonial figure, a pragmatic state builder, operating within the grim realities and moral ambiguities of her time, which included, for example, her kingdom's own complex participation in regional trade networks that sometimes involved enslaved people, or as a proto-feminist icon who subverted gender norms, reflects evolving historical methodologies, new scholarly research, and shifting contemporary concerns. She is a figure rich enough, complex enough, and significant enough to sustain many interpretations, each perhaps revealing another facet of her extraordinary life and the challenging world she inhabited. As we let the image of Queen Nzinga finally recede into the mists of time, what remains is not just the story of a warrior or a diplomat, but of an indomitable human spirit who, faced with overwhelming odds, refused to be broken. She used every tool at her disposal: her intellect, her courage, her adaptability, her faith in its various forms, and her unwavering commitment to her people, to carve out a space for autonomy and dignity in a world rapidly being reshaped by colonial greed and power. Her echo is a reminder of the resilience of the human will, and the enduring power of leadership that refuses to surrender, even when the night seems at its darkest. And so, our long and winding journey through the life of the remarkable Queen Nzinga reaches its peaceful conclusion. We have walked with her from her royal birth in Ndongo, through the trials of her brother's reign, her defiant embassy to Luanda, her rise to queenship, her decades of relentless warfare and astute diplomacy, her forging of the kingdom of Matamba, her complex engagement with Christianity, and her final years as an elder stateswoman striving for a lasting peace. It has been a life of almost unimaginable challenge, courage, and resilience. As the vivid scenes of 17th century Angola, the lush landscapes, the royal courts, the battlefields, the missionary chapels, begin to soften and fade from your mind's eye, allow the story of Nzinga to settle gently. Her struggles and triumphs, her strategic brilliance and her enduring spirit can now become a quiet backdrop to your own descent into slumber. There are no more treaties to negotiate tonight, no more armies to lead, no more colonial powers to outwit, only the smooth, inviting path to deep and restful sleep. Let the cadence of her long life, with all its intricate details and boring but essential acts of governance and survival, become a soothing rhythm, lulling your thoughts into stillness. You have journeyed far, and now it is time to rest. Feel the comfort of your bed, the gentle rise and fall of your own breath, as the complexities of Nzinga's world give way to the simple peace of this present moment. May your dreams be filled with a sense of quiet strength and profound calm, and may you awaken refreshed, carrying perhaps a faint, inspiring echo of a queen who never gave up. Sweet dreams.